Okay, good afternoon or good morning, folks. We're just going to give everybody a couple of seconds to join before we get started. And while we're sitting waiting, good news about Sami Hamdi, the British journalist who was detained in California. So Hatem is out in California. Edward worked with Sami, and Mobashra is in the UK, where Sami is now. So, any quick thoughts on him getting home?
Well, it's a relief. I mean, he never should have been abducted in the first place. He was here on a valid visa doing a U.S. speaking tour. He's done it many times. But under pressure from anti-Muslim extremists, our government grabbed him and canceled his visa. And as the court process unfolded after CAIR California, MLFA, and the attorney Hassan Ahmed filed legal claims, the government never once in court argued that he'd done anything wrong, said anything wrong, violated the law. All they said was, we don't want him here. We canceled his visa, and they never could justify why they did that. So it's a tragedy that he was put through this, but he's in good spirits, and I'm sure he's very happy to be back home with his family. And he
Thanks,
thanked
Ed.
everyone in our community and across the country who spoke up for his rights.
So we'll
Yeah, I
start the
completely
formal
concur.
session in 1 second, but just talking about Sami Hamdi while we're letting people join. Hatem, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I concur completely with Edward in terms of his assessment that he should not have been arrested. Even if the government wants to cancel his visa, the government has complete what you call right if they want to cancel somebody's visa, but you don't arrest him, you don't take him to jail and you lock him up for no other reason that you want to cancel his visa. So he should not have been arrested, especially for expressing an opinion as a journalist, as a public intellectual. So this is actually shows us where we are at, where even the ability to speak for being a Muslim or an individual that is critiquing legitimate policy differences ends up in jail and literally being sent out of the country. I saw the pictures this morning of him landing in the UK. Very positive to see him hugging his family and friends. But this is another case that we need to actually keep on our files.
For sure. So I think we've hit quorum at this point, so I'll start the session and the topic that we're here to talk about. We're talking about Islamophobia and the distraction game. I'll give our viewers a little bit of information about why we picked this panel, and then we'll introduce the folks who are going to be walking us through the subject matter today. So I want you to think about in late 2024, Israel reportedly increased its global public relations budget by $150 million. And Israel's foreign minister, Gideon Sa'ar, said this money would support the government's, quote, consciousness warfare, unquote, efforts. More recently, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding released a report showing that Islamophobia in the United States has risen significantly from 2022 to 2025. And what they noted in that report is that of all the faith communities that they surveyed, but Edward, I'm going to introduce each of you as I ask you your first question. Edward is the Deputy Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, the nation's largest Muslim civil rights and liberties, and advocacy organization. Edward, you saw this information about Israel expanding its PR budget, and then we saw more information about how that money was going to be used and the research that was going into it recently, and that led you to write a piece that's now on Common Dreams. For the audience, can you tell us what's in that piece and sort of why we're here today talking about this subject?
Sure, God willing. Thank you, Corey, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu rasulullah. So I would start by noting the following, that 1 year ago, no one in America, for the most part, was talking about the supposed threat of Sharia law or of the Muslim Brotherhood or of Muslim Americans trying to take over the country. These were debunked conspiracy theories that had faded away years ago. What changed? Earlier this year, the Israeli Foreign Ministry conducted a survey of Western populations, and that survey showed increasingly negative views of the Israeli government because of the genocide in Gaza. In America, in Europe, across the board, increasingly negative views. What the poll also found is that when the respondents were challenged or prompted with anti-Muslim rhetoric, with anti-Muslim conspiracy theories, that support for Israel rebounded by as much as 20 points. So that survey was leaked by Dropside News earlier this year. And around summertime, we saw very suddenly a very coordinated, consistent rise in anti-Muslim rhetoric online from anti-Muslim pro-Israel members of Congress, anti-Muslim pro-Israel hate groups, all singing from the same tune, which is fear the Muslims. The Muslims are coming for you. And it was literally like we've been taken back in time 10 years to when there were states passing anti-Sharia laws, when the ground zero mosque, quote unquote, was the top news item. And so this is all, as far as we can tell, very, very deliberate. The Israeli government and its supporters lost the argument. They could not defend the genocide. They are losing support even among conservatives. And so to distract the American public, they decided to resurrect all these debunked anti-Muslim conspiracy theories. We've now seen multiple members of Congress introduce bills to somehow ban Sharia. We have seen numerous hate groups honing in on this issue. We've seen people running for office make this a key platform. We've seen people burning Qurans on camera. Again, it's all very deliberate. It's all very familiar to those of us who've been around for a while. And it appears to us that this is all motivated ultimately by a desire of the Israeli government and its supporters to distract the American public by stoking anti-Muslim hysteria.
So let me bring Mobashra Tazamal into the conversation. She is an associate director at the Bridge Initiative, which is a multi-year research project on Islamophobia that's housed at Georgetown University. Mobashra, you recently wrote about the political function of the term Judeo-Christian. Can you give us a little bit of insight into the argument you made in that paper?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Corey, for having me on this very important panel discussion. I wrote about how the term Judeo-Christian, we've seen a resurgence of the usage of the term, especially within the context of the last 2 years with Israel's genocide in Gaza. Politicians in the US, in Europe, and in Israel have invoked this term, whether it be Judeo-Christian values, Judeo-Christian civilization, not to signal towards some shared common theological commonality, but it's being used to function as a mechanism of exclusion aimed at Muslims. And it's not what the term was originally used for. It originated, I go through the history of it, originated in the 19th century as a descriptive category, and it became politicized mid-20th century, particularly in response to rising anti-Semitism in Europe and the US. And then the term eventually became adopted by the Christian right, which became, we know, a significant force in American politics in the 70s and 80s. Um, and then we saw a resurgence of it immediately post 9/11. We saw both the right and the left reorient this term towards demonizing and excluding Islam and Muslims. We saw the increased usage of Judeo-Christian civilization terminology by politicians and pundits and religious leaders because they framed the 9/11 attacks as evidence of a civilizational conflict. And the injection of Judeo-Christian rhetoric to signal a sort of civilizational threat or war draws heavily on the works of neoconservative academics, such as Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis. And so today, the function of the term by politicians in the US and Europe and Israel is largely political, and it's used to justify exclusionary policies at home, securitization measures, and imperial violence. We've seen it heavily used when it comes to Israel's genocide in Gaza, with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu himself incorporating it in his speeches to frame Israel as a partner of the quote Christian West against Islam. And then this lays the foundation for further Islamophobic rhetoric and policies, as we've seen Israel's officials using explicit Islamophobic rhetoric to stoke division and fear within the West. I believe it was a couple months ago, Israel's Arabic X profile claimed that Muslims in Europe are a quote fifth column and quote enemy within. And many of these statements, they echo what the global far right conspiracy theories of demographic and cultural takeover. So yeah, the paper argues that Judeo-Christian today functions far less as a celebration of some sort of shared, values between Jews and Christians, and it's far more used as a marker of exclusion aimed at Muslims.
I'm going to bring in our third speaker, Dr. Hatem Bazian. He leads the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project, which is an initiative of UC Berkeley's Center for Race and Gender, focusing on systematical and empirical approaches to the study of Islamophobia and its impact on the American Muslim community. Dr. Bazian, you've argued that after the Cold War ended, Muslims replaced communists as the global enemy, as it were. How does how do Cold War and war on terror legacies still drive Islamophobia in today's media and politics?
Well, first, thank you, Corey, for this webinar. Thanks, CAIR, for the work that has been consistently to document civil rights violations for Muslims and also leading advocacy at this critical time. If we want to situate Islamophobia, even though there are many writings of earlier iteration of Islamophobia or terms that would point to Islamophobia, I think the critical marker is the end of the Cold War and the beginning of discussions among policymakers of what needs to be done to continue this military-industrial complex, this foreign policy apparatus, whether in the United States in particular, but also Europe and other places. And that's where we get Samuel Huntington work, or Clash of Civilization, which really is Bernard Lewis' thesis that Mubashara spoke about. Bernard Lewis' thesis about the Clash of Civilization is a lecture that then Samuel Huntington puts it into an article in Foreign Affairs Journal. Then it makes it into a book, and that book becomes the go-to text for Cold War warriors that basically replaced the red flag enemy with the green flag enemy. And it's very interesting on page 20 of Huntington's book, Clash of Civilization. He basically says, or frame it, that unless we hate what we are not, we can't really love who we are, if we can simplify his thesis. In essence, that internal solidarity in the Western world is defined not by actually crystallizing our values of who we are, independent of an enemy. It's actually we need an enemy in order to construct self-solidarity and self-appreciation and self-love. For me, that thesis actually puts out Christianity on its head, because at least if we understand the basis of Christianity is that love, faith is and hope. That's so much so that God loved the human being that he sent his own son to be sacrificed. Again, this is Christian theology. And that is the basis. And love thy enemy, welcome the stranger. But in Huntington's thesis, Bernard Lewis' thesis, because they are Cold War warriors, but also Israel first in terms of their worldview as well, that becomes shaping the discourse of identifying and using the Muslims as literally the foil in order to construct internal solidarity at a time where much of the Western political economy, neoliberal economics, internal taking away or undoing the social welfare structure that have supported societies and so on. So that shift, in essence, becomes on the background, and everybody begins to be stoked into hating and expressing bigotry toward the Muslims as a way to feel their sense of belonging in the Western discourse. Come into it, actually, Israel and Netanyahu in particular, as early as 1984, begins to put the thesis of so-called Islamic terrorism as the critical threat to be confronted in conferences, then in publications and so on. And Israel immediately shift from a Cold War, two superpowers, into a unipolar world. And in that, Israel wants to make itself as the go-to expert on terrorism, on training, on police training, on surveillance, on intelligence. And through that is massive resources and normalization of Israel presence in our civil society. So that's how we need to understand the long history of Cold War that shifts into problematizing and targeting Muslims as the enemy, and then shaping much of the rewiring of the military-industrial complex, media discourses, and policy to think of the Muslim as, whether it's internal as the fifth column, meaning internal other that needs to be isolated, surveilled, and demonized, and then the external other to be killed, to be intervened on, to have wars. And the Duke University or Duke Institute at Brown University said 4.5 million Muslims have been killed as a result of the war on terror. So that's, again, harken back to a long history. Internal others to be monitored, surveilled, having in an inquisition. And I actually have wrote a piece about do we have a problem with the Inquisition? And then the external is to use war, conflict, and intervention. So that's how we need to understand the period that we are in.
So thank you all for those sort of opening answers. We'll open up the conversation to all three of you in just a moment with the next question. But just a quick invitation to our guests. You're welcome to drop questions into the Q&A. I'll take a look at them and see how we can work them into the conversation throughout, and then, you know, particularly focus on your questions toward the end. Just do keep in mind that I don't expect that our speakers will be responding in the Q&A. We've kind of asked them to focus on the conversation and not their keyboards during the conversation. So, you know, sometimes people are asking us, why aren't you responding to our questions? It's because the people you see here are the ones who are here at this point. We need to be in the conversation. So, you know, from those statements that the three of you just made, I get a bit confused because there are people who say, look, Islamophobia is just, you know, some people hate Muslims. But what you seem to be describing is a bit more of a top-down political strategy. So which is it? How much of it is one? How much of it is the other? Is Randy Fine, the congressman from Florida, posting hatred about Muslims because that's just his worldview, or is he driving towards some strategy with it?
That's go ahead, Rashra.
Are you sure?
Bismillah, go ahead.
Speak over each other, please. Make Fox News. Let's go.
I think to look at Islamophobia, I think it differs from other forms of bigotry today because it's a social and political enterprise. I recently spoke with Dr. Peter Hopkins, who has a book out called Everyday Islamophobia, and he calls it the Islamophobia industrial complex. And basically, there's organizations, there's politicians, there's social media influencers, there's donor funds, there's think tanks who are all basically feeding society anti-Muslim narratives, and they are making a lot of money doing so. Yes, it is an individual prejudice, but it is instrumentalized and utilized by the state. And you see this in policies like we have CVE, we have securitization policies, but you also see it when it comes to justifying wars and violence abroad. You see it in the media's coverage of the genocide in Gaza. You see it in the dehumanization of Palestinians. I think, for example, Randy Fine. Yes, I do think he has personal prejudices, but I also think for him it is beneficial to utilize Islamophobia. It is a strategy as a politician as well. And we've seen this isn't something new. This isn't something that's just happened in the past 2 years. This has been a tactic by politicians and states, especially since post 9/11, to push forth certain policies that discriminate against Muslims, but also use it as a tactic to divert attention away from policy failures and failures of the state when it comes to representing the individuals in the public.
Thanks. Hatem, Edward, it both felt like you had something to chime in with there.
I'll let Edward first and then.
Yeah, so I think I always like to acknowledge that there are Americans of good faith who genuinely have confusion or fear of dislike of Muslims because of misinformation they've received, right? I mean, if I was not a Muslim and I didn't have any Muslim friends, and all I knew about Islam was what I'd seen on Fox News over the past 25 years, I might be a little afraid of Muslims too. Doesn't make it right, doesn't make it okay. I should do my due diligence and learn and not hate people. But you can understand that type of bigotry of just pure ignorance, okay? But the problem that we have is that there are hate groups, there are politicians who know better, who are deliberately lying about an imaginary threat from American Muslims, the imaginary threat of Sharia law, the imaginary threat of this organization, that organization, deliberately lying about this because either they hate Muslims and want others to hate Muslims as well, and or they want to distract the American public from the fact that we are sending billions of our taxpayer dollars to support a foreign government's war crimes, apartheid, and genocide, and distract the public from that by telling them, look at the shiny object, the Muslim next door, not your tax dollars going overseas. I think what we're seeing right now, this coordinated campaign of anti-Muslim hate, is absolutely largely motivated by the latter, by the Israeli government and its supporters. 10 years ago, when you were closer to 9/11, then it might have been more genuinely motivated by a fear of Muslims, a hatred of Muslims, blah, blah, blah. But I think what we're seeing right now is very much a coordinated and deliberate attempt by the Israeli government and Israel first politicians and hate groups to stoke anti-Muslim hysteria to distract from the genocide. And again, to me, the proof of that is that it just all of a sudden happened over the summer without any trigger. Like nothing happened that would explain why there'd be this sudden rise in anti-Muslim bigotry, right? You could jump back 10 years ago and say, okay, the Ground Zero Mosque, as they calls it, or 20 years ago, 9/11, okay, or ISIS running wild, okay, that would trigger some backlash. But nothing happened over the summer that would suddenly trigger this sort of coordinated hate. The only thing that was different was the Israeli government had clearly lost the messaging war, and the Israeli Foreign Ministry conducted this poll that showed Islamophobia was the best way to recover their dropping support in Western populations.
Just building up on what Edward and Mubashir said, we are dealing with an Islamophobic industry. And when I say industry, it's in the full articulation of an industry with mass resources mobilized. I think the report that we done jointly with CAIR at one time, I think we documented 153 million spent over a number of years, and still the documentary Obsession is still one of the largest investment in Islamophobic on stoking Islamophobia in the United States. And interesting, it was during the election of Obama. So often people think that Islamophobia is driven by supposedly Muslim violent incidents, and not discounting that. Actually, Islamophobia intensifies and is stoked during election cycles. This is very well documented here in the United States in a number of reports. It's documented in France during the election with Marine Le Pen, in the UK, in the Netherlands, and so on. So what we have is that the using Islamophobia and stoking anti-Muslim bigotry as a wedge issue in order to influence a particular segment of the electorate in the United States or other countries to shift to vote in particular for the right, for the political right, and increasingly the extreme right. So the extreme right in particular have monetized Islamophobia at the ballot box, knowing that they are part of a shrinking demographics. And the only way for that shrinking demographic to continue to project itself as the defender of the concept of Western civilization is by using the Muslim other as a way to try to win at the ballot box. And in order to do that, massive amount of resources are being deployed. So that's one track. The second track is what Edward said specifically about Israel. I say Israel using Islamophobia as its last resort to rescue a failing settler colonial project. In a way to say to the West, and interesting, when Netanyahu visited France, he actually in a talk with Macron said that Israel is defending Western civilization. I don't know what he was using to say that. At least he did not actually read Western civilization. I don't know which history he was speaking about, but he said that he was defending Western civilization. And then the next few days, the German chancellor actually says, yes, Israel is actually fighting the war for us. So in here, Israel is actually understanding the landscape in Europe and the United States and using Islamophobia to drive its interest in maintaining a settler colonial project, defending itself in a period of genocide with ICC court case and also a global shift relative to Israel's standing. Now, I want to add a third component in here, which actually, for us who are doing the work, Muslim majority states that want to also project themselves that they are defending what's called good Islam. Mahmoud Bamdani's book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, can get into the conversation. They actually are also inserting themselves into the debate in the West to try to say that these Muslim organizations, these Muslim groups, these Muslim communities are a threat to your society and you need to restrict them. And look at us of what we did. And that's where the conversation about the Muslim Brotherhood movement and the restrictions that are being projected on Islamism. This is a project that is coming predominantly from Muslim majority states in alliance and in relations with the pro-Israel forces. So you have the United Arab Emirates that is actually spending massive resources in Europe. The Egyptian government as well, that is in visitation and conversation to try to say that these Muslims that are living in the West, enjoying the civil society that is open in critiquing their own the government's policies, these have to be restricted. So you are actually seeing a configuration, Western right wing, trying to preserve whatever vestiges of their majoritarian demographics. Israel, pro-Israel forces both from Israel and in the West, and then Muslim majority states that inserting themselves to drive Islamophobia. So those are the components of the industry. Individual discrimination, I think it's a norm. Everyone has what you call individual discriminatory attitude, but we're not dealing with individual discriminatory attitude. We're dealing actually with a structured program and project that have millions of dollars directed at it for a particular political purposes, domestically and transnationally.
So I'm going to bring in a question from Steve, one of our guests here real quick. And Steve, I'm just going to sort of condense your question if that's all right. But what Steve's asking about is efforts to enact the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which is well known to folks for conflating criticism of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. The author of that definition in front of Congress actually said that it shouldn't be used for policy purposes. But Steve's asking, is that part of the distraction that we're talking about? What do y'all think?
Now, it's not a distraction. It's quite open. So, the use of anti-Muslim bigotry it's designed to change the subject, to focus on something other than Israel, Palestine, and the genocide. But those individuals attempting to enshrine IRA in the law are very openly focusing on the issue, and they're trying to silence free speech in the name of countering anti-Semitism, which is not what they're doing at all. So I consider those two different things. IRA has been pushed for years, and obviously it's been very much pushed in the wake of the Gaza genocide. But that didn't just start this year. That's been a long-term separate project that the Israeli government and supporters are pushing. I wouldn't say that's a distraction. I think that's quite out in the open, obvious what they're doing.
Yeah, if I can talk about the weaponization of the IRA and anti-Semitism as a lever to try to limit Muslim engagement in civil society and presence in Western society, heightened more with the current genocide in Gaza. To step back, the history of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism dates back to a long, long history. Again, when I work with a number of scholars, you could actually take a look at the Crusades, where both anti-Muslim sentiments and anti-Semitism went hand in hand. You go to the Inquisition and the expulsion of Muslims and Jews of Spain, you see it during the colonial era and the period. What the IRA is attempting to say that anti-Semitism, especially if you look at the ADL writing in the 1970s, says that there is a shift in anti-Semitism, that now anti-Semitism is in the far left or the left, and also the pro-Palestinian. And that occurred after the 1960s. And the ADL has been consistent in never missing an opportunity to express its Islamophobic tendencies by using the fight on anti-Semitism, despicable as it is. Actually, we had a gathering between a number of scholars that work on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism to try to actually derive how to deal both with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism without weaponizing it for foreign policy objectives, which is what is taking place in relations to Israel, where the examples that they give in the IRA, 5 out of the 7 examples have to do with Palestine and Palestinian pro-Palestinian expression in relations to the West. So what we are seeing is an attempt to weaponize and limit the scope of freedom, academic freedom, freedom of speech, constitutional, even journalists' ability to write and engage on the subject. And I think we need to be aware of it without actually losing sight of the seriousness of anti-Semitism in the West. Notice that Israel welcomed Gerd Wilder into Israel, welcomed Marie Le Pen into Israel, welcomed Angel Farage into Israel, welcomed much of the right-wingers, including Elon Musk doing the Nazi salute. He is okay. He's kosher in relations to the expressions that he does, as long as he commits himself to supporting Israel. So we need to actually be very critical of the use of IRA and weaponize it, while simultaneously be very firm in how to actually counter and fight its anti-Semitism as it rear its ugly head in Western society, which I actually said that this will actually occur relative to how the right wing have become triumphant. And as soon as it became triumphant, it actually began to be at ease in expressing its historical anti-Semitism. And I think that's very clear that we have to be there, to be very clear in terms of how we analyze it.
So we've got some good questions building up in the chat, but before I get to the next one from there, I think it's important to ask you all about AI tools and social media targeting. How is that changing the game? How is that being used to keep the public's attention on, in the case of the United States, hating other Americans simply because of the faith they practice, rather than worry about things like, I don't know, Epstein, the amount of money that's going to Israel, and things like that. Can you expand on the use of AI and social media for us?
I'd be happy to start on that one. I mean, the use of social media, especially, I think we saw the level of censorship with the genocide in Gaza, and we saw how tech platforms in Silicon Valley is very much so politicized in the sense of the censorship that pro-Palestine voices and anti-genocide voices faced on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, on all of these platforms, and even with the Trump administration's pressures on TikTok and the contract to buy TikTok to create a US version where it would censor free speech and censor free expression. It shows us that social media platforms don't function on some outside of the political spectrum. They're very much so part of it, and this is where a lot of the disinformation networks are present on. You have figures. We talked about Sammy's case. Figures like Laura Loomer and Amy Mack are huge. I mean, I guess you call them influencers. They're on social media. They push out conspiracy theories. They kind of uh, create targets and go after them. And unfortunately, they are connected to the Trump administration. People in the administration are listening to them. And they were the ones they had sent false reports about Sammy to the administration. Along with that, social media platforms themselves, they're failing. I wouldn't say they're failing to tackle. I think they don't care or they approve of the hate speech that's on their platforms, especially when it comes to Islamophobia. I mean, under Elon Musk X, he got rid of a lot of the content moderation teams and whatnot. So there was a big surge in Islamophobia on X. But I think overall there's also a reluctance to acknowledge that Islamophobia is a problem. Rather, it's more seen as I mean, Megyn Kelly recently said it, she called it a sensible thing. And I think in society today, with these tech platforms, with governments, with politicians, they think it's a sensible position and it's totally acceptable to espouse anti-Muslim hatred. And then obviously, you have governments who I think are using social media platforms themselves to push out hate and to push out disinformation. I cited that tweet earlier from the Israeli Arabic official Twitter platform, and they've pushed out a couple of very, very blatantly anti-Muslim Islamophobic content that actually is very reminiscent of things that I've seen in Europe from far-right figures, say like 5 years ago, talking about a fifth column, talking about an enemy within. Um, so yeah, I think social media platforms play a very central role in how disinformation is spreading. And I think it's not just like online influencers. I think states are playing an active role in utilizing because there is no regulation, there are no monitoring or oversight of these platforms.
Yeah. If I may add on terms of the space of social media and technology, the motto in the Silicon Valley, which is just down the street from us, was "Do no evil," right? The notion that technology would be actually a tool for good. I think that motto, "Do no evil," has been transformed into "Do more evil," or literally "do evil," because as we understand, technology has been utilized in the genocide in very clear way, whether it's Nimbus, Google platform, even for Facebook data, and so on, in such a way that the targeting, the surveillance is something that is very clear. And even before that, we know the case of Pegasus, which is the break into phones that became a very important case both within the United States and Canada. People think that AI, artificial intelligence, is a high level of intelligence. Let me put it this way. AI, artificial intelligence, is built on the same distorted, stereotypical, racist attitudes that inform the algorithm that is actually there. And therefore, the biases that has been in the society is built into the algorithm or the AI. This is even without the level of surveillance and the level of intervention by the government as well as by other individuals that are right now in the leadership. So now the algorithm is specifically shaped to permit Islamophobic discourse and not flag it for monitoring energy, while simultaneously allowing, in particular, Israel and other state actors to limit and censor and shape the algorithm to remove the content that is actually speak of the genocide and what is taking place in Palestine. So those are the issues that we need to talk about AI and how structurally is being shaped in order to further what I would say Islamophobic discourses and Islamophobic content that is driven by high elite political actors, rather than see it as a neutral tool that people are using it. Though that time of it being a neutral tool was long time ago, now it's actually is an instrument of furthering power dynamics and in elite political preferences. Maybe in here I'm speaking about means of productions and some of these theoretical aspect, but those who own these platforms are connected not only to elite political formation, but also drive benefit, maximum benefit in terms of financial terms. There was an article today, actually, in the Wall Street Journal, says how the war in Gaza was actually beneficial to big business, which literally is saying that from the death and the genocide in Gaza, we made money, so you should not critique the genocide or actually bring this into the forefront in our discussion.
So, continuing to keep an eye on the Q&A, but I do want to pose this next question to you all before I get to what's there, because some of what's there is a lot about helping us toward wrapping and thinking about what we should be doing about this problem. But if we're talking about Islamophobia and a distraction, particularly in the context of Israel, how is Islamophobia influencing debates around humanitarian aid to Gaza or Palestine? And since we're talking about Islamophobia, I do want to acknowledge that anti-Palestinian racism also plays a large role in influencing aid. But what are your thoughts about that? How is this distraction shifting people's attention away from getting basic humanitarian services to people who have just endured a genocide and may continue to do so?
I'll take that briefly and note that put aside even the idea of getting aid into Gaza, there were Palestinian children who were coming here to receive medical treatment after being injured by American weapons, and our government blocked them from coming under pressure from some of the most notorious anti-Muslim extremists. And the argument these extremists used was it's an Islamic invasion. These injured children are somehow, in the minds of these lunatics, represents an Islamic invasion. And so even then, even though that was really motivated by anti-Palestinian racism, hatred of Palestinians, but they used anti-Muslim bigotry to try to justify why the government needed to block these children from coming here for treatment. So as you just said, there's a significant overlap in, at least in current times, between anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Muslim bigotry. Just like there can be overlap between anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Black racism, the time that we're living in right now, there's a lot of overlap. At CAIR's office, many of the complaints that we got in late 2023, 2024 that are counted as anti-Muslim also had some element of anti-Palestinian racism to them. And so I think, again, Islamophobia is very easily used, easily weaponized to achieve goals meant to harm other communities, in this case, the Palestinian community.
So I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly. You're saying that children who had been injured in Gaza were brought to the United States for help, and somehow this was weaponized as a threat.
As an Islamic invasion, right? And Secretary Rubio, who apparently is not in charge of his own State Department, canceled the visas of other children who were scheduled to come here and would not let any more come under pressure from an outside anti-Muslim extremist who hates Muslims. And that was enough to get our government, scared and frightened of a social media backlash, and to make children suffer in the meantime.
Thank you. So FM Kaz, I know your question's about statistics, but I wanted to emphasize Edward's point there because in conversations with reasonable people, I think we can all hear how unreasonable what Edward just discussed is. Hatem Mobashra, what are your thoughts on that question?
Go ahead, Mubashir.
Yeah, I was going to add one other example that I think also brings in the role of mainstream media, not just the government, but media has played a really, really big role in justifying and defending the genocide, specifically the New York Times. There was at the height of the famine, we've all seen the videos and pictures of starving children and babies, and I believe this was in the New York Times. They did a story where they had a picture of a starving child, bones, everything showing, and there was a backlash to it because the child had a previous condition, as if that explains why the child is starving and not because Israel's siege and um, a very sort of the tactic of starvation was imposed by Israel on the people in Gaza. And the New York Times, I think, they published it with a little disclaimer saying, "Oh, we didn't properly identify this child had a pre-existing condition," as if that was to blame for being starved. And that I think what we're all getting at is also that Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism have played a central role in dehumanizing Palestinians. So even injured children, amputees who are in dire need of medical care are framed as a threat by describing them as an invasion. These are, again, children, starving children, injured children. And that dehumanization has allowed for Israel to kill tens of thousands of children. And the conversation is continuing now in that Israel is using Islamophobia to also distract from the fact that humanitarian aid is not getting in. Yes, there's a ceasefire, but Israel has not been abiding by the ceasefire. The amount of humanitarian aid needed, I think there were estimates of 10% getting in. And there are still not Palestinians who are in desperate need of medical care abroad are not allowed to leave. So there's, I believe, 7,000, 8,000 in need of medical evacuations. And so all of this has been allowed to take place because Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism has been used to dehumanize Palestinians so that even an injured child can be framed as a threat to Western populations.
Wow, that's a heavy thing to end on there, Mubashara. That's hard to sit with. Hatem, I know you had some things to say on this question.
Yeah, I think in terms of when we look at drivers for Islamophobia, I think anti-Palestinian racism is a main component that has been built into the Islamophobic industry. And even if you go back to, let's say, Jack Shaheen, in terms of the documentation of Hollywood, Real Bad Arabs, but a heavy set of movies, almost 300 movies that were focused or heavily intertwined into anti-Palestinian racism. If you think about Edward Said's work on Orientalism covering Islam, even if you think of Mamdani's work, all of this actually can get us an idea of what are the drivers of Islamophobia, and you need to dehumanize the people to justify their elimination. And what is today certain is that the total dehumanization of Palestinians has become a fact on the press, the fact on the policymakers, and facts on the discourse, so much so that we actually cast doubt on actually the veracity of how many Palestinians have been killed, the veracity of actually children that have been maimed and continue to be destroyed and eliminated, on the veracity that Palestinians actually are demanding their freedom like any other normal people that living under a settler colonial project. That is only driven by this systematic process of dehumanization, that they are treated, considered, and framed as subhuman. You could see this with Reuters when their own journalist actually is killed. They don't mention the name of their own journalist on the ground. And they obfuscate in the language. The headlines, whether New York Times, Reuters, BBC, and so on, has been horrific in a structural dehumanization and a structural elimination of 278 journalists, Palestinian journalists that have been killed. You don't like Palestinian adults? Well, here are the journalists where even at the basis of it, we defend the right of journalists to report, but it seems complete silence. And Amanpour says, "Oh, we don't have any Western journalists on the ground." That's a big question to ask. Why you're not on the ground? Anderson Cooper comes on the other side of the Gaza and he say, over there is conflicts, and he's sitting there acting as if he's reporting. That's not reporting. That's just like literally being an instrument for propaganda. And we know all of the stories coming from Palestine. Reporting has to go through the Israeli military censor. That's the reality of how structural dehumanization occurs.
So I alluded earlier to a question from FM Kaz. And to frame this question, I want to go back to something Edward was saying earlier, that we started to notice an increase in the anti-Sharia framing and the Muslims as a threat framing, really sort of more toward the spring, summer. So maybe the answer to this is not yet, but the question that FM Cause is asking is, can we point to statistics about the increase in Islamophobic activities such as policies, publications, false news recently that's being used to distract people from what's going on? So what do y'all think about that?
Well, I'm confident that when we have our annual civil rights report and Islamophobia report done, we'll be able to show some additional information. For now, though, anecdotally, we can very clearly see that there are bills being introduced in Congress this year related to Sharia, Muslims, free speech for the Muslim community that did not exist last year, that were not being introduced last year. You have politicians this year who are obsessively talking about Islam and Muslims, like Senator Tommy Tuberville, who probably didn't know what a Muslim was a year ago, or didn't know they had Muslim constituents a year ago. And so anecdotally, for those of us who do the work of countering anti-Muslim bigotry, we can very easily see a huge difference in what we were dealing with last year versus this year, and 5 years ago versus now. But again, I think once we have our report at the end of the year, we'll be able to document that in more detail. One other thing I want to mention that I do think contributed to this rise in anti-Muslim bigotry is also Zoran Mamdani. Once it became clear that he'd won the Democratic nomination, for much of his campaign, anti-Muslim bigotry was there simmering, but it really hit high gear near the end of the campaign when it seemed like everything else that they threw against him didn't work. And then those last few weeks, you saw a very intense push centered around anti-Muslim bigotry that brought up 9/11, Imam Siraj al-Hajj. Like they took everything out of the toolbox. And so I think that also has contributed to the rhetoric, but even that came late. That would not explain what's happening in May or April, well before it was clear that he was going to be elected mayor of New York.
Others?
Yeah, just to add, I don't think well, I don't have numbers, but just from observation, earlier this year, I think there was really an increase in international pressure when it comes to Israel's genocide in Gaza. It was also at the peak of famine, starvation, images, videos constantly of children dying, of babies without formula. And we saw more and more reports from human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Beth Salem, an Israeli human rights organization. We saw, I believe it was over 500, uh, I believe over 500 scholars of genocide rightfully calling what Israel has been doing in Gaza a genocide. This all happened this year. So I think in the face of growing international pressure, not just from Muslims, but human rights organizations, this is a large coalition. You have UN experts, UN reporting itself saying genocide is taking place. So I think in a way to divert attention away from growing international pressure, Islamophobia was again a tactic used to divert attention away from that.
Okay.
I think if my memory served me, Othering and Belonging put a full report. I think post Trump's first term or in the middle of it. Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, which is a partner organization that have also a project on Islamophobia, documenting, I think, 34 states that had legislations, anti-Sharia legislation. And the interesting part is at the time that the use of anti-Sharia legislation was specifically to create a fear or enhance the fear, even though that there was no Sharia being implemented as laws. It was literally from David Yorshalimi who led this effort on anti-Sharia legislation. And that came in right now rearing back as a tool to try to create that fear during electoral process. What I think Zaran Mamdani's election is showed us is that the massive amount of spending that went to try to stoke Islamophobia have failed. And that failure is because people have, one, recognized the genocide that is taking place in Gaza, and the second is the emergence of a critical young population, again, those below 35, that are no longer able to accept the normative patterns of Islamophobic discourse and fear to try to register victory at the ballot box. Now we have to wait and see whether this type of strategy would lead for Republicans and Democrats to abandon Islamophobia moving into the midterm election in 2026. So that still is a question that we need to actually see, because I do think that both Democrats and Republicans bet on the Islamophobic. That's why they did not want to endorse Mamdani. The attack on him on anti-Semitism and on his Islam and on Islamophobia were the two pronged. And Hakeem Jeffries, just like a few days before he got his shawarma sandwich, goes and endorses. Mamdani was too late actually for an impact, but he wanted to actually what you call hedge his bets, knowing that the data showing that Mamdani is going to win the election. So I think there is going to be a lot of studying into the numbers and figures to see whether Islamophobia is still going to be utilized in the 2026 election and the anti-Sharia, or we're going to see an abandonment considering the shifting of the landscape of the electorate in New York in particular. I don't know how it's going to be in other states, but is the big question for us.
So just to take moderator's privilege for a second, the Center for the Study of Online Hate already put out a study on the social media attacks on Zoran Mamdani. So that's one set of data that you can go to their website and acquire. And then, yeah, Dr. Bazian also mentioned the study by the Othering and Belonging Center at UC Berkeley. They did the study a few years ago, but they've kept their data set up to
Yeah.
speed. It doesn't include 2025 yet, but you can look at it and you'll see this giant arc around 2015, 16, and then it tapers off to the last couple of years. There's only been a couple of anti-Islam bills introduced at the state level. This year, our government affairs department at CAIR has counted 4 anti-Sharia bills at the federal level at this point. And then anyone who's watching Texas has seen that Texas Governor Greg Abbott said he has banned Sharia in his state. So before we return to the questions, I want to start thinking about solutions. We have a hard stop on this webinar at 15 minutes past the hour. So, we'll go for a few minutes yet, but the first question is, these distractions are being thrown out there consistently. And Edward, I want to start with you on this one, since you're, in particular in an organization that deals with this directly. How do Muslim advocates avoid getting trapped in purely reactive cycles of outrage as these distractions are thrown at them and the community is like, you got to deal with this?
Yeah. Now that's a really good question. So again, if the goal is distraction, that means that when a Tommy Tuberville or a Randy Fine, or take your pick, screams something ridiculous about Muslims, or tries to introduce some anti-Muslim bill that has no chance of passing, they not only want to increase their social media following, they not only want to scare the American people, they want to distract you, the person who is actually trying to advocate for a just American foreign policy, for Palestinian human rights. They want you off topic, and they want you to be marginalized and smeared. And so we have to strike a balance between completely ignoring this stuff, because completely ignoring it can be dangerous as well, because that leaves the whole playing field to them, but also not overreacting every time they say something, and then feeding into what they want, which is debating that issue. So from our perspective, we try to call it out for what it is. So when Tommy Tuberville says, as he did a few days ago, for example, the Quran teaches X, Y, and Z, and that's why we have to ban Sharia law. Now, we could argue with him and say, no, actually, the Quran says this. Here's the verse number and blah, 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 and you should like, or we can say, you've never read the Quran. Your real issue here is you're an Israel first politician, and you're trying to stoke anti-Muslim hysteria for the benefit of the Israeli government, but the American people are not falling for it. So, in other words, respond, but don't take the bait. Don't start debating the substance of Islam with someone who knows nothing about Islam, but rather refocus the conversation on what they don't want to talk about, what they want to distract you from, which is the American government sending our taxpayer dollars overseas to fund war crimes. And it's important to note that among conservatives, they're also waking up as well and recognizing increasingly this is not America first, it's Israel first. And Corey, I'll briefly just want to address something that was in the chat, a question. There were 2 questions. One was from a Muslim who said, I work with the Republican Party. There's people there who seem like good people who want me to get involved, want to break down barriers. And another person who asked, what about interfaith dialogue? Should we still be doing interfaith dialogue? And I'm a big fan of engaging with people, of going into hostile environments and engaging in conversation. I see no issue with that. The thing that I think we have to avoid is interfaith dialogue that is set up by and being used by people who want to distract from the issue. So if you've got some anti-Palestinian organization that's inviting you to engage in interfaith dialogue because they want to just focus on, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and let's just all get along, and they want to use that as a cover, right, to normalize accepting, ignoring the genocide, well, that's not acceptable. But if you, for example, are initiating conversation with your local Republican Party because they want to dialogue, they want to understand what your perspective is, they're not looking for a photo op, they're not looking to cover anything up, your local Republican Party, for whatever reason, wants to actually have a genuine private dialogue, why not? If your local synagogue or church or whatever wants a genuine private dialogue and they're not looking to cover up anything, well, that's fine. The thing that I would be very aware of is being used as an instrument of normalization, of genocide, of occupation, apartheid, or to cover up any of those things. But aside from that, I think dialoguing and debating and letting people on the other side see that they're being lied to is valuable. And you've seen the benefit of that in some conservatives you never, ever thought would have anything nice to say about Muslims at all, sing a different tune because they actually saw and met with Muslims Palestine advocates. I met with a very prominent Islamophobe whose name I won't mention because I don't want to get her in trouble a few months ago, and was just stunned by the turnaround. And that was just by her seeing footage of Palestinian kids being killed and realizing this is wrong. This has nothing to do with America first. And then engaging with Muslims and Palestinians and going, wow, I've been lied to about what you all stand for.
All right, so that's 3 questions, 2 from Edward, 1 from me, queued up for Mobashra and Hatem. Dive in, guys.
Did you?
Go ahead, Mubashira.
Okay. I think a really good example of how to tackle it for especially Muslims who are interested in politics and getting involved is how Zoran Mamdani approached it. He had been getting targeted by Islamophobic rhetoric. He had been being smeared as being anti-Semitic throughout his campaign, and um, he didn't engage with that sort of little stuff that kept coming up. His focus was very much so always the bread and butter issues of New Yorkers, of cost of living, income inequality, and building his broad multicultural coalition. But towards the end of the campaign, when Islamophobia really surged because it was a last-ditch efforts by elites, um, he addressed it in that really, really powerful. It's about a little over 6 minutes on social media. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend watching it because I think it's a masterclass in how to respond to Islamophobia in the sense of, like Edward said, call it out for what it is, and then also center the experiences of Muslims. So much of Islamophobia has been done to dehumanize Muslims in the sense that also when there's been a response, it's been very much so defensive and very much so, well, no, this is what the Quran says, or meet a Muslim, come, let's talk to us, that sort of stuff. Whereas what Zoran did was Muslim New Yorkers are scared to walk the streets because of the bigotry espoused by politicians on social media. Muslims, women who wear the hijab are disproportionately targeted by harassment, by violence. Showing the consequences of Islamophobia on everyday individuals is very powerful, and I think that is a way to also help the public understand because most of the time anti-Muslim incidents aren't covered by mainstream media. We hear about it in our spaces constantly because we work in this, but when it comes to the average person, they don't know when a mosque is vandalized. They don't know when a Muslim woman is targeted because it's not covered. So I think also when it comes to, I think we were talking about, um, I wanted to touch on this point that Dr. Bazian had mentioned about anti-Semitism and the weaponization of anti-Semitism. Um, Very interesting things are happening on the right in the sense that there are individuals who previously built platforms on Islamophobia who are now very, very critical of America's foreign policy, especially America's alliance with Israel. At the same time, they're also mainstreaming far-right fringe anti-Semitic voices like Nick Fuentes. So when the smears are always used against Muslim voices who are pro-Palestinian, who are talking about the genocide, but the right has a very, very real problem with anti-Semitism, and we need to talk about it because um, it is a very real issue. There are rising anti-Semitic hate crimes, not just in the US, but across the globe. And it's what the media and politicians will have you believe is that Muslims are responsible, but if you look at the figures, it's primarily coming from the right wing voices and right wing views.
Yeah, if I may add on, especially on the interfaith, what I call interfaith washing, which I think Edward have covered. I think we have to be very firm and very clear that we are for interfaith work for justice, but we're not for interfaith washing. Second, there are a number of groups and organizations that they believe Muslim agency and entry into civil society comes through somebody else opening the door for you. Meaning that they believe that their relationship with the ADL, their relationship with the AJC, their relationship with JCRC and other groups is the way for you to enter into civil society. And we have to be very clear, there is no such thing as free lunch. There is no such thing as you being on the table by somebody opening the door for you or having the key. You're most likely is on the menu and not realizing the fact of what is taking place. So we're not for Muslims thinking that their agency in the society is by means of somebody having the key to the door. You need to build your coalition and you need to be engaged. Which gets me to the third point. Muslims agency in the American society and other society is in partnership and in coalition with individuals that have commitment, ethical commitment, moral commitment to a society that is just based, that is fair, that is anti-racist. So you have to express as much opposition to Islamophobia, as much opposition to anti-Semitism, as much opposition also to anti-Black racism, which has become normalized, anti-Latino, anti-immigrant. So we have to have a very ethical, grounded worldview and not to go for what you call a quick access. The access that is given to you is often previewed at silencing rather than actually having your voice, problematic or critical as it may be, you have to have your voice. So I think that's where our worldview and our engagement has to be. Lastly, is that we have to be out in the political arena. I think what Zahran Mamdani and others as well the election in Virginia with Hashimi, I think, all these point that engagement and being there with your own platform, with your own ideas is the way for us to move forward. And I think our ideas grounded in our Islamic ethos. I do believe that we have a lot to offer in American society, despite all of the distractions that are attempting to silence us. I think we do have to offer, we do have solutions, and we could offer solutions to the multi-pronged problems and challenges that are facing our society.
So Hatem just teed up my last question for you all perfectly. I appreciate that, sir. We do have agency, right? As Muslims and as an organized community. So as we wrap up the session, what are your thoughts on a media or a policy goal in 2026 or starting now that could meaningfully push back against Islamophobia and refocus the conversation on things that actually matter to the American people, such as our tax dollars being used to commit atrocities overseas?
Who wants to take it?
So look, I'll start by noting that, the fact that the genocide occurred, is the clearest sign that people who care about justice have not built enough political power in the United States, right? Most of our politicians who supported the genocide didn't do so because they enjoyed seeing pictures of children being killed, because they even care that much of what happens overseas. But they made a very deliberate political decision that, I'm more concerned about losing my seat, and I'm more afraid of people who support the Israeli government than I am of people who oppose the Israeli government's genocide and the electoral consequences. I think that pendulum is swinging now. I think now you clearly see politicians saying, I don't want to take money from AIPAC. You see elected officials winning office who you never thought could have won elected office while recognizing the genocide in Seattle, New York City. And so I do think a transition is certainly coming, and a lot of that change will have to happen in politics through political work, political activism, building political power. For those of us who work in the civil rights field or the academic field, I think our job is different. I think our job is to continue to fight in the court of public opinion, in the court of ideas, to not only expose the true motivations behind the bigotry that we're seeing, but to then debunk the argument, the argument that our nation should be sending billions of dollars overseas to fund oppression instead of helping people here at home. I think those of us who are civil rights activists who work with other communities, have an ability and a responsibility to pursue that. And I think that'll be our fight, while politicians and those elected and engaged in politics also fight to build power to make sure that something like this never happens again.
Yeah, I had 2 points. So working within academia, I think um, the past 2 years has shown us that there are a lot of problems that we're having in academia in terms of the protection of free speech, and especially coming from administrations within universities? And are they upholding their academic integrity? Are they really committed to their mission when it comes to educating their students and providing an environment which encourages critical analyses and encourages debates and conversations and really is committed to free speech? Working within academia, it also a lot of the conversations and the work that's done sets the tone. We've seen how the works of Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis influenced U.S. foreign policy and continues to do so. So I think research and rigorous research and continuing to put out informative and fact-based analyses on what is happening is so crucial. Along with that, I think there needs to be tech regulation and there needs to be policies tackling hate speech on these platforms. We need, I don't know what it looks like, but we need something to tackle um, social media platforms are existing in this their own realm where they're able to influence politics, also shape narratives, also then excuse themselves because they say we're not a media organization or we're not so and so, we're a social media platform. So I think policy hasn't caught up to how fast we're moving when it comes to the digital age. So there is a big need for regulation, for policies that tackle hate speech that especially now with AI, we're entering a whole new universe. I think that is a big area because a lot of Islamophobia is spread through narratives and is spread through what we see and read online.
So if I may add the following, I do that think that this is the critical moment for us to actually do strategic investments in the work that is needed, both to counter Islamophobia, but also to open a broader space for Muslim engagement in society, for advocacy, whether it's advocacy at the political level and advocacy in society. And I maybe shared this, I'm still very critical of the level of investment from the Muslim community in areas that have the ability to make substantial change for the long term. So I would begin with that top of the pyramid, is that that investment is not there. Second is that we need to invest in long-term type of projects, programs, rather than a single event outcomes. Many would actually, we're going to be coming close to the period of Ramadan. There are many effort that takes place during Ramadan on a one-off type of engagement that really does not actually have a strategic view and commitment to it. So I think that's very important for us in there. Third, I do think we need to be contrarian in many of our ideas in order to actually be disruptive in relations to the norms of what we're there. What is very impressive about Zoran Mamdani's election is that he was disruptive and did not allow the norms to actually dictate his campaign and the ideas that are there. People will reject your ideas even if they're outlandish, but you actually have to be able to create your own narrative and your own scopes of ideas and let the others actually be the ones to critique rather than us trying to critique the narrative about us. I think we're often so much focused on trying to respond to that narrative against us rather than creating our narrative. So I think that is very important as a way for us to engage in the society. Lastly, I feel very optimistic in the days and months coming ahead, and possibly in the years, that we have reached a tipping point in the public political discourses. And I think what we need is to be audacious in putting ourselves out with our ideas at this point, because I think the future looks bright despite the darkness that is surrounding us. And I think that's how we should walk, with confidence and understanding that we have a major contribution to do, because fearful people can't actually change or transform history. And I think much of our discourse have been looking at the mirror and fearful of who we are, rather than actually look in the mirror and say, I can change the world. And I think that's where we are moving ahead we are able and we have reached a tipping point to be able to change the world to the better. And that's what I think our role in the days and months and years ahead.
So thank you all very much for joining us today. I want to first of all thank Geraldine, who none of you can see, but who ran the back end of today's webinar, right? None of us look good unless she's doing her job well. So thank you, Geraldine. Dr. Hatem Bazian, Edward Ahmed Mitchell, Mobashra Tazamal, thank you all for your expertise today. And to our guests, thank you all very much for giving us some time out of your schedule. And thank you for contributing your questions, right? Those made the conversation more robust. And gave us some different things to consider. So that's the end of our webinar for the day. Thank you all very much for joining us. We look forward to speaking to everybody again sometime in the future.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.